Okay, today we're going to talk about Samuel and Kings, the books of Samuel and Kings. The first real slide gives a brief summation of 1st and 2nd Samuel from Barry Banstra's article in the HarperCollins Bible Dictionary. And he notes that there's three main characters that arises in the story in the books of Samuel. Samuel, who's a judge, prophet, and priest. Saul and David, and I've got a little slide in there of a sculpture of David by Bernini. Excuse me. 1st and 2nd Samuel chapters 1-2 act as exposition for the whole work in the sense that it sets up the overall plot. We find this figure Samuel who's born through miraculous means to Hannah. And there's a lot of parallels between Samuel's birth and Samson's birth in the book of Judges. Both are given up as a vow to God. Both kind of miraculous type births. But the birth of Samuel contrasts with the priest Eli's sons who are wicked. And I reference 1 Samuel 2:11-17. Now, 1 Samuel chapter 5 sets up the ark being in control of the Philistines. And I've got a slide in there about the Ark of the Covenant being returned by the Philistines, an interesting drawing. It's from the HarperCollins Bible Dictionary. The Ark was taken to the Temple of Dagon. It's essentially just one of those stories of, it pops up, this theme, this motif pops up a good deal in 1st, 2nd Samuel and 1st, 2nd Kings, the idea of superiority of Yahweh against the other gods, that he's the real true God and these other gods are nothing. The ark is in the presence of the statue of Dagon, and it's pretty much just it's defeated. It ends up no hands. It ends up just pretty much to pieces because of the fact of the power of God versus this lifeless statue. And a similar type motif pops up in the story of Elijah, the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. My God is a real true God. It's not really my God's bigger than your God, but it's more so my God's a true God and yours ain't. Again, it ties in that motif, the enduromistic history of there is only one true God. This emphasis on a monotheism type religion. 1 Samuel chapter 8 gives a foreshadowing of some of the kingly failures. Up until chapter 7, Samuel had been identified as a prophet and a judge. In the first part of chapter 7, he's portrayed as a judge. You kind of this tie over from the book of Judges, this tribal chieftain type leader. His sons are named judges and they are corrupt. Chapter 8, verse 3, and the people demand a king. And Samuel goes through this list of 6 things that the king will do. He will take, blah, 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 blah. And these seem to echo back to some of the stipulations in Deuteronomy. Again, at enduromistic history, Deuteronomy and the tie-in and the subsequent books. But these failures listed by Samuel foreshadow some of the failures of the kings that play into the notion of enduromistic history, blaming the kings for the fall of Judah and Israel, and especially the Babylonian exile, the failure of Judah. And these failures happen off the bat with the first king, Saul, who's anointed king. In chapter 13 and chapter 15 of 1 Samuel, Saul has several large failures here. And essentially, in chapter 13, he's waiting for Samuel to offer a sacrifice before he goes into battle. Well, Saul doesn't want to wait anymore, so he offers a sacrifice. In chapter 15, Samuel orders Saul to attack the Amalekites, killing the people and the animals. Saul's disobedient and spares the king of the Amalekites and offers the best animals as sacrifice. Chapter 15 concludes God rejecting Saul as a king. In fact, 1 Samuel 15:11 says, "I, the Lord, regret that I made Saul king." God regretted. It's pretty darn strong. So disobedience is there. This questioning of God's authority. Now we see some disobedience in the life of David, but it's not to that degree. It's not that questioning of God and his authority and his ability. It's not the questioning of the Lord over the vassal. 1 Samuel 28, if you're aware of the prohibition of Deuteronomy 18:9-14 against mediums and necromancers, then this story in 1 Samuel 28 is a red flag of Saul's disobedience to God, his failures as a king and trusting in Yahweh as God alone. he seeks a necromancer. Some translations call her a witch. Lives at Endor, and I just thought Endor is where the Ewoks lived. If you're a Star Wars fan, you might get that. But he's looking for advice. Samuel's already gone, he's already dead. So he goes to this necromancer to try to get advice from Samuel. And this story, this necromancer, this witch, whatever you want to call her, calls up the spirit of Samuel. And it's if you want to say there's a ghost in the Bible, this might be one of your instances of saying ghost in the Bible. If you're like one of these ghost hunter fans or whatever, it's something to think of. But it shows the inadequacy of Saul as a king in this story. It's just kind of the cherry on top of the cake there, or top of the ice cream. And I gave you a slide more on divination in the ancient Near East, kind of give you, again, fleshing out what you guys will do in the paper as far as looking at the context of things, the ancient context. There's a discussion of the mediums and spiritists that Victor Matthews and et al. Give in the IBP Bible Background Commentary, as well as the article on divination from Benko and Powell from the HarperCollins Bible Dictionary. Now, 2 Samuel chapter 11 is another key chapter in the books of Samuel. It's the story of David and Bathsheba. It's important to keep in mind that in this narrative, David is the king. He's the male. He has the power. And he uses power to initiate relations with a married woman. She had no choice. Kind of talking about the whole Mel Brooks theme in some of his movies. If you ever watch like Blazing Saddles or Spaceballs or anything like that, it's the whole "good to be the king" theme. It pops up in History Roll Part 1. It's good to be the king in the sense that David is the one with the power. It's not that Bathsheba was trying to seduce him. At least the text doesn't say that. People read that into the text. It's just that he had the royal power, and he abused his royal power to be with this woman. And he ended up having her husband offed, in a sense, and tries to cover it up. And his hands called on it by Nathan, the prophet. And the story of Nathan in this instance, in the confrontation of David and Bathsheba, brings to mind one of the things that pops up in Samuel and Kings is this notion of the prophet speaking God's truth to power, or keeping the kings honest, calling them out for their indiscretions, their sins, or trying to give them direction. Nathan calls out David's sin, brings it to light. In the Bathsheba adultery, murder of Uriah situation. Chapter 13 of 2 Samuel is discussion of the rape of Tamar. Tamar is one of David's daughters. She is raped by her half-brother Amnon. David pretty much doesn't do what he should as far as punishment of Amnon. So Absalom, Tamar's full brother, David's son, Amnon's half-brother, essentially kills the half-brother Amnon and starts a coup to take over David's kingdom. Essentially, David's sin with Bathsheba, his disobedience of God, starts this kind of snowball effect of David almost losing his kingdom and to his son Absalom. Again, the notion of disobedience is punished, or disobedience leads to bad things happening. 2 Samuel 24, David messes up again. There's a census taken, and there's a plague sent. Now, the corresponding story, a version of this in 1 Chronicles, blames it, David taking a census on Satan's activity in 1 Chronicles 21:1. But the writer Samuel is more concerned about God's control of historical events, and he says that the intervention was proved, the census was prompted by the Lord, God prompting the census. Some would say that the chronicler is trying to smooth out the theological road bumps, the theological difficulties in the Samuel passage. But that's something, Chronicles is dated later normally than Samuel Kings, and Chronicles retells different theological slants on things. Kind of like in the New Testament with the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John sometimes talk about the same story, especially Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they tell it from different slants, different emphases. Each one had their one side they wanted to point out about Jesus and his ministry and his life. The chronicler and the one who wrote Samuel Kings, the scribes who put those together, they had different emphases they wanted to put into the story. Moving on to Kings, I've got a slide here kind of summarizing the books of 1st, 2nd Kings. First Kings essentially starts off with the reign of Solomon and his faithfulness, and it ends, well, the first part of First Kings ends with Solomon's apostasy. Apostasy is essentially turning away from God and turning to these other gods that his wives brought in. He married a bunch of women, they brought their gods in. And people like Gary Knoppers would argue, and I think rightfully so, that Solomon's reign sets up kind of a structure for the books of Kings, in the sense that almost like a reverse thing, where beginning Solomon is faithful, he's obedient to God, he asks for wisdom instead of riches and fame, and God grants his riches and fame because he asks for wisdom. All this good obedience to God. Then there's apostasy, and the kingdom essentially crumbles in the hands of his son Rehoboam. That is then righted in the end of 2 Kings, chapter 22-23, with the reign of Josiah. Josiah is a righteous king who undoes the apostasy of the previous kings, such as the wicked Manasseh. And whereas Solomon built the temple and then brought in these sacred groves and high places for people to still worship, and allowed them to exist, Josiah cleared the land. He washed things away, and he focused on the temple and centralization of worship in the temple. 1 Kings 11, here's a summarization from Jerome Walsh's commentary in the Sacropagina series. It's talking about Solomon's tragic failure in chapters 1 through 13. It says the first part of the chapter is not, strictly speaking, a narrative. There's full dramatic movement. He's looking at things literarily here. It tells in general terms rather than through the scenic depiction of Solomon's infidelity to Yahweh, the consequent punishment of Yahweh's decrees. Most of the material is in the form of the narrator's summary. This is so essentially, one of the things I want you to take note of is that some of these commentaries, especially Walsh, have a different angle. He's looking at things literarily and trying to notice this kind of structural differences and contours of the story, and that's one of the things you're going to have to pay attention to in your paper. Now, conversely, Mordecai Coogan in the Anchor Bible series, in the next slide, fleshes out a lot of details, little tidbits about the language and culture of this passage, talking about the Pharaoh's daughter and the daughters of the Ammonites, Syrians, and so on and so forth. This apostasy, or this letting in of these different gods, essentially in chapter 11, led to chapter 12 and 13, where under the reign of Solomon's son Rehoboam, the kingdom splits. The way it's framed in domestic history is essentially some of the sins of Solomon led to this split. Things such as the corvée taxes, build temple, things like that, that led to it too. But the guy who sets up the kingdom of the north, Jeroboam, he does some bad things too. In chapter 13, he sets up places of worship at Bethel and at Dan. Chapter 12, at 1 Kings, and he sets up golden calves, very much akin to the golden calves set up in Exodus. It's at Mount Sinai when Moses is on the mountain. And the reason the text says that Jeroboam did this is so that people would not go back to Jerusalem, to the temple, and worship. That the people's allegiance would still be in his kingdom, and they would stay in his kingdom to worship. Setting up. See, one thing you got to remember about these ancient cultures is that there was really no separation between the government and the religion. Government and religion were pretty much the same thing. The king was set up by the gods for the most part, and in some ways the religion helped support the kings in their endeavor. A lot of these ancient Near Eastern cultures were like that. Usually the king was portrayed as being blessed or chosen by the god, or a son of the god, in some cases the Egyptians, and so on and so forth. Even some of the Psalms, the royal Psalms, kind of set up this notion of the king as being a royal appointee of God, and God undergirding the king. And they're kind of, especially these enthronement Psalms, almost have the king is almost like a divine-like figure. It's a weird air that's going on there. But there's some elements of foreshadowing in chapter 13 of 1 Kings, and it's almost predicting Josiah through this story of a man of God coming to the north and condemning, having a discussion with another prophet. And again, Josiah pops up, and this is where my dissertation comes in here. 2 Kings 22-23, this great king Josiah seems to be the guy who comes in and fixes things messed up by Solomon and all the subsequent kings. In chapter 21 of 1 Kings, Manasseh is elevated with a stock, or excuse me, evaluated with a stock phrase, he did evil in the sight of the Lord. When there are bad kings in 1st and 2nd Kings, you're going to see they either did right in the sight of the Lord, something like that, or they did evil in the ways, evil in the sight of the Lord. And King Josiah and Hezekiah are evaluated positively for their religious reforms, destruction of idols and some centralization of the cultus, all of which are emphasized in Deuteronomy and domestic history. Manasseh is deemed wicked because of his promotion of idols, and as well as child sacrifice as a form of idol worship in 2 Kings 21:6. Josiah's scribes and reform, we find that in chapter 22. There's a document found. The religious reforms at the temple in Bethel and Dan were promoted by this scroll. It's the first time in the Old Testament you find a written scroll prompting any sort of religious fervor. Reading and writing was a faculty of the elite, the people of the time. And these elite people mostly were scribes. Though there may have been some form of common or vulgar writing ability, just simple writing, most part reading and writing was a trait of a small percentage of people. Probably less than 10% of the population could write. Some scribes, like Shaphan in chapter 22 of 2 Kings, function almost like a secretary of state in the political sphere. He's well-knowledged and well-read. Now, a minority of scholars, influenced by De Wette, a German scholar's position, call this scroll find a pious fraud because it was very timely and it prompted this reform. According to this view, the religious centralization reform was a centralization of power for the king, as well as centralization of money for the temple in Jerusalem instead of local worship sites. In other words, instead of the money flowing out to the boondocks, it all flow into Jerusalem and buttress up the temple. They're probably not. That's a minority of scholars we want you guys to be aware of. Some of you can argue that the scroll find does, and the reforms does in some way, not only centralize religion, but it kicks out these deities that are associated with the Neo-Assyrian Empire, or even function as avatars for the Neo-Assyrian deities. And I've included a slide in there, a picture of an Egyptian scribe here, some scribal stuff there. It's really interesting. And another slide about another statue of a scribe and a scribe before a king. And I've included also a timeline of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And again, they were the big kids on the block for a while. They're the ones that destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel. And eventually had influence and sphere over Judah and shrank it to Judah, nation of Judah, essentially down to this land surrounding Jerusalem. And as they waned in power, as empires do, the next one coming up will be the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And they're the ones who sacked Jerusalem, essentially, and they exile people back to Babylon, different parts of the Babylonian Empire. The Assyrians, in their sacking of Samaria, the northern kingdom, and its capital, Israel, in the capital Samaria, they did deport people to other lands. Deportation, exile, was a way of control. You take the best and the brightest away. The ones who they were the ones more likely to have a revolt. The workers, you had to have workers in lands. You left the kind of the working class. They seemed to be more docile, supposedly. But you take the best and brightest away, and you reappropriate them and throughout your empire in different ways. Either just put them there, or use them some function in some court. And some of the stories found in the Old Testament, like Daniel or so on and so forth, where these best and the brightest reappropriated into the king's court or different aspects of the empire. And I include a slide of the Persian Empire because there's at the end of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, there is the rise of the Persian Empire, and they essentially take over the Babylonian Empire. And the figures come in there with Chronicles in this Chronicles beginning of Ezra and Nehemiah with Cyrus. Cyrus pops up in the book of Isaiah, Cyrus, who lets the people go back from Persia, Babylon to Judah or Jerusalem. He is viewed as almost like a messianic type figure, God's anointed, God using him. So anyway, if that's a different book, different day, thank you. Have a good day.